is a person of my age still hanging in there and beating her head against the wall on federal budget issues when they seem to get worse and worse. And I have been. In the last 3 years, I've spent a lot of time on two major commissions on what to do about the rising debt and the federal budget problem. The president appointed me to the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which, as you know, was mostly elected members of Congress. It was supposed to be all elected members of Congress in its original incarnation. The idea was that we face this looming deficit problem with the debt projected in everybody's projections to rise faster than the GDP as far as the eye can see. And of course you can't deal with that in an election year, can you? So we should have a commission to meet. The election in question was 2010, by the way. And the idea of, the first idea that Senators Conrad and Gregg had was, let's have a commission modeled after the base closure commissions, they always said, although one might think that the federal budget was a more complex issue than closing military bases. But the idea was, since our democracy isn't working very well and we don't seem to be able to solve these things by the regular legislative process, let's have a commission to meet during the run-up to the election and come up with a solution to the long-run deficit problem, and come back and tell us what it is, and we, the Congress, will vote it up or down. Now, you might think, if you were students of public policy, that was a sort of fanciful idea, that they were going to write a proposal that would rewrite Medicare and Social Security, rewrite the tax code, and bring it all to the floor for an up or down vote. Oh, come on. But believe it or not, that was the idea. It got 53 votes in the Senate. It didn't get the required 60. So the president, I think quite rightly, said, this is a good idea. We ought to be focusing on this problem, and I will do it by executive order. And so he created a commission of which there were 12 members who were members of either the House or the Senate, half and half Republicans and Democrats. And then he added Simpson and Bowles as chairs, and 4 other public members, of whom I was very fortunate to be one. And meanwhile, my friend and long-term colleague when I was at the Congressional Budget Office, and he was a senator from New Mexico running the Budget Committee, Pete Domenici, he and I had, meanwhile, before Simpson-Bowles was a reality, decided, you know, there ought to be a bipartisan group sitting down out of the glare of publicity to try to find a bipartisan solution to the budget problem, and let's do it under the sponsorship of the Bipartisan Policy Center. So, rather remarkably, I found myself doing 2 of these things at once, and out of that experience, I have become a missionary for bipartisanship, for reasons I will come back to in a minute, and a missionary for the general framework, the grand bargain, if you will, which came out of both the Simpson-Bowles and the Domenici-Rivlin groups, And every other bipartisan group that has sat down and seriously looked at the budget problem, the arithmetic drives you to roughly the same answers. And so the problem is not that we don't know what to do. The problem is getting it done in our polarized political situation. Now, you all know the outlines of what we ought to do. The budget problem is driven by the fact that we have, on anybody's projections, federal spending over the next several decades, rising faster than the GDP. And that's not because of all the things that are argued about in political campaigns. It is almost entirely, in fact entirely, driven by the fact that we have a baby boom generation retiring and moving into the eligibility ages for Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and at the same time have rapidly rising health care costs per person, and the multiplication gives you a very rapid increase in federal spending, and revenues won't keep up. No matter what we do, the tax code, the revenues will grow about as fast as the economy grows, and that's not fast enough when your spending is growing faster. And so, if you sit down with a bipartisan group, you're driven to this solution that is, we have to slow the growth of healthcare spending. And as it shows up in the federal budget, that means Medicare and Medicaid, but you can't do that in a way that just shifts the cost to the rest of the economy, because healthcare spending is a problem for all budgets, state and local and business and family. So you have to find a way to deliver care more efficiently going forward and more effectively for everybody. And everybody's kind of agreed on that. And also agreed that it's possible because we have a pretty wasteful system. And at the same time, you have to take a look at the tax code and say, can we raise more revenues in a more pro-growth way? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. I mean, the tax code is perfectly awful. It's riddled with horrible accumulation of provisions that nobody in their right mind would have designed from scratch, that reduce the tax base and therefore make the necessary rates to raise any given amount of revenue higher than they would have to be. And most of these provisions are regressive in the sense that they benefit upper income people more than lower income people. And you wouldn't likely have designed it that way, but here we are. So the potential for actually blowing up the tax code and starting over and saying, what would you really like to do with an income tax if you were starting from scratch is there. And both our commission, Pete's and mine, and the Simpson-Bowles Commission came out with that combination of possibilities. Now, but the real problem is the polarization of the politics, which is much worse. Those of you who've delved into this political science literature, it's much worse than it used to be. And the overlap between the parties in Congress is effectively zero. In the old days, there used to be conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, and there aren't anymore. And so we have much more cohesive ideological parties. Political scientists thought they wanted that. They thought it would give us accountability. It would be nice if we had clearer choices. Well, it might be if we had a parliamentary system, but we don't. We have a constitution which essentially mandates compromise across ideological or party lines, or you don't get anything done. You're mired in gridlock because our founding fathers in their wisdom created so many checks and balances and centers of power that compromise is required to get anything done. So right now we're not getting anything done. And it is extremely dangerous. And this is the long answer to why am I still hanging in there doing this. I'm scared to death that we will have gridlock. That means we don't do anything about the budget problem. And the characteristic of the budget problem is it gets worse if you do nothing. We, at some point, will have a debt rising much more rapidly than our GDP, and when that's true, and it's already true, you're at risk of having interest rates go up very rapidly, of losing the confidence of your creditors. And sure, we used to say we're not Greece, and we're not. Now we have to say we're not Greece, we're not Portugal, we're not Ireland, we're not Spain, we're not Italy, we're not France. What? Well, wait a minute. Those are economies, some of which used to be fairly strong. How long are we going to be able to say, we're different, we're not like them? People will always buy our bonds, no matter what, because they believe in the strength of the U.S. economy. Anyway, that's why I'm still hanging in here, and working on the budget problem. But I believe it to be a general problem. And the budget looming catastrophe is not the only problem that gets worse if we do nothing. Climate change is the other obvious one. It is, and you'll notice that we aren't even really talking about it in the election anymore. We used to talk about whether carbon tax was better or worse than cap and trade. Now we're not talking about it because everybody's afraid to get out front on whether climate change is even happening. This is not a way for a grown-up country to behave. And you came to the Glenn School to fix that, and I hope you will. But I would love to interchange. I've talked longer than I intended to with you about how you see the current scene and whatever else you want to talk about.
So later today, you are going to be giving the Barbara K. Fergus Women in Leadership lecture over at the Union, and of course that's going to be focusing on women in leadership. So I wanted to ask you about how being a woman impacted your ability to engage and organize everything that was needed to build the CBO.
Leadership, because I want to talk about the things that matter to me, and if they want to call that women in leadership, that's fine with me. But I am a woman, and I'm old enough to remember when rooms full of graduate students didn't look like this. They were much more men, and this is at least half women. I would just guess eyeballing it, and that's great. The CBO was founded under the Budget Reform, the Budget Empowerment and Reform Act of 1974, and it was the most exciting thing that I have done in my career, and I commend to all of you, if you get a chance to start a new agency, grab it, especially one that has been set up because the Congress felt they needed it. And I was really lucky to have been chosen to start the Congressional Budget Office. Justine Weiss was lucky to have been chosen to start the Glenn School, I think. Starting something that doesn't exist is a really, really fun thing to do. It's hard, but it's entrepreneurial. You have to figure out what do we really want to do, how do we get started, what kind of a workforce do we need to recruit, how do we convince people that we're not a threat to them, we're really needed, and go forward. And I'm very proud of the CBO because A, it's still here. There were many predictions in the 1975-6 period that it would not survive. There were people who didn't want it to survive on Capitol Hill, and I think that's probably true of any new agency or business. Your competitors don't wish you well necessarily. And the appropriations committees in Congress had been in charge of making decisions about how much goes for what and so forth. And there were tax committees. Who were these budget committees who were layered on top of them and doing what they were supposed to do and creating this new agency? There was a lot of skepticism about this. But just to come to being a woman, that was a period in which choosing a woman to lead something was an unusual and gutsy thing to do. And the credit goes to the Senate Budget Committee. And a funny story goes with it. When they decided to recruit for the new Congressional Budget Office, the House and the Senate did a really dumb thing. They had two separate search procedures. And not surprisingly, they came up with two different candidates. That was predictable. And they were actually two plausible candidates. The House had chosen a very capable man named Sam Hughes, who was then the Deputy Controller General. And he was more of a numbers cruncher, less of a policy person, but that's what the House wanted. The Senate wanted more of a policy analysis, an analyst like me, and it was actually the late Senator Cranston of California, who most of you have never heard of, who put my name in play and said, why aren't we considering Rivlin? Is it only because she's a woman? And that embarrassed them, and I got on the short list. After the interviews, I emerged as the Senate candidate. But then they had two candidates, and they didn't know what to do. In the House and the Senate, there's never much love lost between the two. And so nothing happened for a while. And partly it was a gender issue. The then chairman of the House Budget Committee was a congressman from Oregon named Al Ullman. And Al Ullman was said to have said, I don't know whether he really did, that over his dead body was a woman going to lead this Congressional Budget Office. And so there was gridlock, if you like, for a while, and nobody was appointed, and then an unusual thing happened. Wilbur Mills, who was chairman of Ways and Means, a very capable, smart congressman with a great deal of power, but what nobody knew, or not the general public anyway, was he was an alcoholic. And one night he got drunk and was driving by the tidal basin with an exotic dancer named Fanny Fox. And Fanny leaped out of his car and into the tidal basin. That was the end of Mr. Mills' career. And why am I telling you this? Because the ranking member of Ways and Means was Al Ullman, who moved up to Ways and Means. And that left the chairmanship of Budget to Brock Adams from the state of Washington. He hadn't been involved in the original selection. He essentially didn't care. He wasn't a sexist. And he said to Senator Muskie, if you want Rivlin, it's okay with me. So I owed my job to Fanny Fox.
When the top marginal tax rate was 70% for unearned income, only 50% for earned income. But from World War II through the mid-80s or early 80s, the top marginal rates were anywhere from 70 to 90% or more during the Eisenhower administration. And at least compared to the 21st century, the economy moved along pretty well. I mean, my question is, why did the Bowles-Simpson Commission think that it was so imperative to reduce top marginal tax rates rather than even raise them, but at least keep them the same with the closing of tax expenditures? I'm just, in my mind, I'm just baffled, not by the, at least bipartisan, I'm not talking about the ideologues who want virtually no taxes, but is there a budgetary and economic reason why what we did from the 40s through the early 80s not a good idea? That is very high marginal rates.
Historically we've had much higher marginal rates, especially at the very top. I mean, there was a time in World War II when the top marginal bracket was 91%. Now, we were obviously doing that to mop up all of the spending power that we couldn't let loose because we would have had a horrible inflation in the middle of the war. So there were reasons for having such high rates, and nobody was worried about jobs or employment at that moment. But they came down gradually through multiple iterations, as you say, so that we're now down with to a top marginal rate of 35%, which I am always surprised at the political rhetoric. There's an awful lag in these things, and the political rhetoric is still that if you raise marginal rates, people won't work as hard, and all the rich people I know are workaholics anyway. That's how they got to be rich people. And I just wonder who are these people who are going to put in less hours or not invest because their marginal tax rate might go back to from 35 to 39. It's not like it was going from 70 to 90, which you might kind of understand. However, generally speaking, marginal tax rates, most economists think, discourage work and investment, and though we're skeptical that it makes much difference at the margin at places we're at now. But it's a good selling point with Republicans to get marginal rates down. The other part of the answer is the tax code is so loaded with what are really expenditures, things that ought to be on the spending side of the budget, but that have been thrown onto the tax code for various reasons. Reducing those tax expenditures is another way of reducing expenditure, and raises more revenue, and raises it in a progressive way. And if you want to be aggressive about that, which a lot of us think is a good thing, you can actually afford to bring the rates down a little more. So if you're crafting a bipartisan compromise and you want to raise more revenue, but you want to bring both Republicans and Democrats on board, a good thing to do is to say to the Republicans, look, this will cut your marginal rates even further a little bit and still raise more revenue, and to say to the Democrats, this is a more progressive tax code, and to say to both, it's more pro-growth, and you got a winning situation. Now, is that the way I would actually design it if I were doing it all by myself? No, but when you're in this bipartisan thing, I think you've got to give something on the R side.
So just anecdotally, I was in marginal rate of 70%, but I never billed fewer than 4,000 hours a year during the whole 70s when we were confronted with that. So it just doesn't wash.
I can believe
I would work less with a lower rate or work more.
And you know, well, the discussion about marginal rates and how they affect the labor supply. First place, the data isn't very good. The evidence is that for the primary breadwinner, and that's still mainly men, it doesn't make much difference. Within reason, what the marginal rate is. People are working in a regular career, 40-hour or more work situation, and they don't reduce their hours. But secondary earners do. And the impact on the secondary earner, which is often the part-time work of the wife, can be considerable can be influenced by marginal tax rates. So that's the economic argument, but mostly it's a political question.
You wrote a book, I think, based on your experience at HEW called Systematic Thinking for Social Action, in which you laid out a potential agenda for improving decision-making in the federal government and pointed out opportunities for doing more systematic evaluation that would inform that decision-making. Looking back on it and how far what has been done since you wrote that book, where do you think we are in doing that kind of analysis and improving decision-making in the federal government?
Book in 1971, and I thought it would have a very short shelf life because it dealt with health reform, poverty. We were going to solve all those problems, right? And nobody was going to read my book. Surprisingly, people actually still read it. And that's largely because we haven't made all that much progress. But with respect to policy analysis, I think we have. We've decisions at every level, including, I think, even local level, are much better informed than they used to be, and people ask questions about how do you know this will work, and what is the experience, and can you actually take this little demonstration, what are the chances that if you take it to a different place or to a different level it will actually work. There aren't always answers to those things, but people ask the questions, and they're the right questions, including how much will it cost. Now, if you're as old as I am, you remember when mostly those questions weren't even asked. In the 60s, when I first served at HEW, we were just coming through the Great Society programs. Most of them had been passed the year before I got there, but the program like Head Start, for instance. There were one or two demonstrations that had shown that intervention at early ages was a good thing. Mostly people just thought, hey, that's a good idea. Let's do it. And the question, how much will it cost, and how will it work, and how will we know if it's working, were not really on the agenda. Now, maybe that's good, maybe it's bad. It did lead to a lot of false starts. I don't think Head Start was one of them, but it did lead to people just doing something because it was a good idea, or it seemed like a good idea. Medicare actually was a good example. I wrote in the HEW job, or presided over, the first projection of the cost of Medicare done in a systematic way. And I wish I had the number in front of me, but you would laugh if I did. We had vastly underestimated the cost of Medicare. And we're just beginning to realize it at that point. It wasn't the demographics, it was what was going to happen to the healthcare system and the explosion in medical costs that we've seen. But anyway, there's a lot more information. Is decision-making better? At the level of the executive branch, I think it is. That there is more serious attention paid to whether things will work and how they will work. It is very difficult to evaluate the effectiveness of federal programs because so many of them aren't just federal. They are grants to state or local government or to nonprofits and so forth, and the federal money may be rather small. But I think the level of information and the sophistication of the discussion is much higher. What's gotten worse at the same time is the polarization of politics. Because there was a time, not so distant, when members of both parties on the Hill would sit down and work something out. And you know, they might have differences about what the information was and what the evaluation showed and whether it was worth doing it, but they wanted to do something and they would compromise their differences. And that's not happening anymore, and it's back to my distress about gridlock. And the problem is not that we need more information now. We have plenty of information. We just need people who are willing to work out compromises and get something done, even if it isn't their favorite thing. On that note, my big hero of the moment, well, there are two actually, maybe three, members, the Senate members of the Simpson-Bowles Commission. Senator Coburn, Tom Coburn from Oklahoma particularly, he is a very conservative man, really conservative. He believes in small government, but he also believes that we ought to get the debt under control. And when he signed the Simpson-Bowles report, which called for higher taxes, he said, there's a lot in this report that I don't like, but I've figured out something. If we're going to solve this problem, Tom Coburn isn't going to get everything he wants. And I think that's the spirit in which it has to be addressed. And I believe it's the spirit in which Dick Durbin on the other side addressed it. He is a real liberal Democrat. You heard him at the convention the other night. And he really believes in the efficacy of more government programs and in taxing the rich more and whatever. But he also voted for the Simpson-Bowles report. And it may be significant that senators were willing to do that. Mike Crapo is another example from Idaho. The House members were not. They were facing re-election. They didn't want to get out of line. And neither the Republicans nor the Democrats, with one exception, voted for the Simpson-Bowles report.
Fairly new to policy and public affairs, and just in career, first semester student. What would you recommend as far as just from a career, from a philosophy, and getting into this, being fairly new? What generally would you recommend for somebody?
Well, first you ought to go to a good public policy school. And I teach at one. I teach at the Georgetown Public Policy Institute. We haven't yet made it to the august ranks of being a school. We are still an institute. But we're a thriving master's program in public policy, and I am very impressed with the students that come there. And I'm sure this counterparts are in this room who are seriously dedicated to improving public policy and want to figure out how to do it, and that's why they ended up doing this degree. But I think that's a good place to start. There are lots of places you can be effective, and I think the federal government is one, but state government really has very interesting problems to be solved. And as do local governments, and you can get your feet wet, as it were, much faster in a smaller government, and find yourself on the forefront of the local issue, whatever it is. Now it has some downsides, because then your neighbors come to you and say, my pothole needs to be fixed, or my kid isn't doing well in the 6th grade, can you fire the teacher? But you have to explain that that's not what you do. But any level of government has jobs which you can be effective in quite quickly. if you get in the right place and do it right. But the nonprofit community has enormous influence on what happens, and I blanch a bit when people talk about special interests. Though I'm worried about the influence of big money in politics, but we can't do without representing the various interests in our democracy in some way. So whether you're an advocate for a cleaner environment or more fracking, you need to we need people on both sides of a lot of public issues that are taking it seriously and taking the data seriously and trying to figure out what's the right thing to do, no matter what point of view they're
Anyway, in support of these big changes that are needed.
I hope so, but I wonder why it took them so long. Because the problem of the unsustainability of the track that the federal budget is on is not new. Since it relates very heavily to this demographic set of facts, it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody as smart as Jamie Dimon. But the business community has sort of been absent until very recently. And now I think there are a number of groups coming together, and some of us have been active in a campaign that we call Fix the Debt, which is bringing a lot of business leaders and business organizations like the Business Roundtable into the fray, and on a nonpartisan basis, and saying, get together folks, do something, and do something along the lines of Simpson-Bowles, Domenici, Rivlin. I find espousal of Simpson-Bowles is sort of a metaphor. It's not do exactly what's in that report necessarily, but it is recognized that the framework is necessary and that it has to involve entitlements and taxes. This is as good a metaphor as any. Now, I think it's belated. I hope it's not too late. And the real problem at the moment is this fiscal cliff that we haven't talked much about, that is looming at us, this artificial hurdle that hits at the end of the year, when if we don't do anything, the tax rates revert to the pre-Bush days, and the spending takes an across-the-board wallop, which is quite mindless. It's equal percentages across the programs that are affected, and you'd never do it that way if you were doing it sensibly, but they didn't want to do it sensibly. They wanted to say, this is so outrageous that it won't happen, we won't let it happen, and therefore we'll have to come up with something more sensible and get to the grand bargain. I hope that works. I'm not sure. Right now the gridlock is so bad that I think the best that can be hoped for in the lame duck session, and that's all we have between now and New Year's Eve, is that they will do some combination of kicking the can down the road again, meaning shifting the Armageddon date to some later but not too distant date, like June 30, and I hope they don't do just that, because then we're back in the same suit, and putting in place a framework where they require themselves to come back with some real answers, and to say by that date, or maybe a closer date, the committees will bring back a set of proposals that do this, this, and this. They raise this much revenue by this time, and close the gap on spending in this way. It has to be pretty explicit. It has to be written like reconciliation instructions, if you're familiar with the Budget Act works. So that you don't spell out all the details, but you do say you have to get to this number by a certain date. I think that could work, but even getting that far is going to be a big stretch after all this yelling at each other in the election, no matter who wins.
Simpson and Bolt's commission report, there's this fascinating policy change to a partial early Social Security benefit that you don't hear a lot of people talk about. And in the Domenici-Rivlin, of course, there's this national retail sales tax. You don't hear people talk much about that too. And you being in both of these places, I'm wondering how much was cross-pollinated and the evolution of both of these things as being in separate things, but not in each other's.
I don't know if you all heard that, but in Simpson Bowles, and I'd forgotten this, there is a Social Security change with an earlier benefit?
Yeah, it's like a half benefit available from age 60 onward for, say, a partial retirement benefit.
I'd forgotten that, but we did a lot of back and forth on what to do on Social Security. And you're also right that in Domenici-Rivlin, at least in the first version, we had a what we call the debt reduction sales tax, which was a broad-based consumption tax to be collected like a value-added tax. And that reflected the consensus of the commission that it was time the United States stopped being the only country in the world, or the only major one, that doesn't have a broad-based consumption tax and relies very heavily at the federal level on income taxation. And we should diversify our sources. And we had a big discussion in the group as to whether our second source should be a broad-based consumption tax or a carbon tax. And I think I would have voted for both, maybe did, but the consensus was also if we propose two new taxes, we'll be laughed out of court, so we better decide. And a carbon tax, which I think is a very worthy thing, and we ought to have one, gradually rising over time. A carbon tax doesn't, at any feasible rate, raise as much as a broad-based consumption tax. So we went with that. We called it a debt reduction sales tax because we had come to the conclusion that the value-added tax was probably the best way to collect it. It has good experience in most of the countries that do it, which is most countries in the world. But our Republican governor, Frank Keating, former governor of Oklahoma, clenched it. He said, I could sell a national sales tax to my Republican colleagues, but a value-added tax? It sounds too French. So we said, okay, Frank, we won't call it that. And we didn't. However, as the discussion wore on after we put the report out, first report, and we got back into the next year in which there was these repeated set of failures culminating in the super committee, and we were working with all of the people involved, hoping to get to some positive conclusion. As that wore on, the sales tax dropped out. Just because we couldn't get anybody to focus on it. So we revamped the report, redid the numbers, raising the top rate in the income tax a little bit to raise more revenue, and substituting for the sales tax. But that was a purely political judgment. That was just, this has no traction, there's no point in talking about it. Now, Social Security is somewhat similar. We had good discussions in both commissions on what to do about Social Security. In my opinion, there's no question that we should act now to put the Social Security system on a firm foundation for the future. the idea that you can just let it go and say, well, it doesn't actually run out of money, the trust fund doesn't run out of money until 2037 or 6 or 5, the number's coming closer. So we don't have to do anything right now. That's ridiculous and it's irresponsible. And it is also not understanding how the Social Security system works, which I'll spare you for the moment. But 2037, which is when the fund could actually not pay all the benefits and would have to cut the benefits back to the revenue coming in. 2037 used to seem like a long time away, but people in this room, people in the labor force, will be retiring in 2037 or later. And you need to know that the Social Security system is going to be there for you, and that you don't have to worry about that. You can build your retirement in whatever your career is around some certainty about the Social Security benefits. And that's not true now. So the fact that Social Security has really dropped out of the whole conversation, may have missed it, but I didn't hear anything about Social Security in either convention. It's just gone away. Like climate change. And we can't let that happen. It's not as difficult a problem as the health care reform, but it needs to be done.